All right, let's kick this off. Thank you all for joining. I'd like to welcome Dave Taku. He's the Senior Director of Product Management and UX for RSA, and he'll be speaking today about anatomy of the attack, the rise and fall of MFA.
Great, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Great, awesome. So good morning, everyone. Always great to see everybody here on the second day after all the parties and everything else, right? You guys are the troopers. I look around the room, and I'd encourage you just all kind of take a look around the room, right? And I'm just amazed at how packed that this room is. Has nothing to do with me. I'm sure most of you don't know who I am, right? This is just a testament to how relevant this topic is. So I hope all of you at least take comfort in the fact that you're not alone, right? I mean, everybody's here for the same reason. Hopefully, I can share some information here that's valuable to you. We can all learn from one another. Before we get going, I am required to show this disclaimer. RSA conference cannot be held responsible for anything I say or do on stage. Also be aware of the fact that you may be videotaped and audio recorded. So let's get into this. Last year, 2022, was a pretty interesting year for us as cybersecurity practitioners, particularly if you're involved with identity or with multi-factor authentication. Coming off of several years of the COVID pandemic, people working from home, remote and hybrid work becoming so much more common in our industry, I think most organizations began to recognize that they hadn't already the need for multi-factor authentication. In fact, by some measures, as many as 78% of organizations are now very broadly using multi-factor authentication to protect their users. And yet at the same time, we saw in 2022 some of the most significant and high-profile attacks on multi-factor authentication. So, why are these attacks on the rise, and what is it that we as security practitioners can do about that? Aldous Huxley, a famous author, most known for his work, Brave New World, which ironically, he warned about the dangers of technology in the wrong hands, right? And that's a lot of what we're facing today. Huxley was also a bit of a philosopher, and he coined this phrase, the law of reversed effort, where he said, it seems that the harder we try with conscious effort to do something, the less we shall succeed. So is that what we're facing? The harder that we try to protect with MFA, the less successful that we're becoming at it, right? Well, I would argue that in this particular case, maybe this law doesn't apply. In fact, a lot of the challenges that we're seeing is not because MFA is becoming less effective, it's because the attack surface is actually increasing. All of us here have a much larger scope of responsibility than we did even several years ago. Our users, they are employees, they are our customers, they are our partners. They are not contained within a physical building or within a segregated network anymore, so we're protecting people who are everywhere and all sorts of diverse types of people. There's been a real push, and for those of you who attended the keynotes yesterday and you heard Rohit Ghai speak about the second wave or evolution of our industry and this push towards convenience and the way that mobile has really changed the game, where it's become more imperative for us to not only protect the assets of the company, but to support and propel the business forward to enable the business to make information readily available to our constituents, right? So that has brought a lot more demand and created a lot more attack points for us from an identity perspective. And finally, IT modernization. Who here is going through some sort of a zero trust project, have mandates to take a cloud-first approach to things, right? So all of these things are vastly disrupting the way that we've done things for years, and they're creating all these new ways for attackers to be able to exploit the chinks in the armor. So if we take a look at this, one of the things I put out there is that, while this session is titled, the anatomy of the attack on MFA, and there's a lot of focus on authentication, authentication really is only a part of that puzzle. It helps us to answer one fundamental question about our identities. Who are those people, right? And so we tend to focus on things that compromise that who question. Phishing attacks and brute force attacks that allow people to steal the credentials that would be used to say who somebody is with confidence, right? But I would argue that in order for us to be able to defend our identity, there's a much bigger attack surface that we need to understand and appreciate and take a look at. So you think about, the classical 5 W's, in journalism: who, what, where, when, and why. We need to understand what do users have access to. And a lot of these attacks that you'll see, they may begin with a compromise of a password or an MFA credential, but they then proceed on to taking advantage of the fact that these users' accounts have access to things that they shouldn't have access to? Or where are these users stored and how are those user accounts managed? How did they get the credentials that they received? Another common attack vector we're seeing is not necessarily compromising the multi-factor authentication credential, but taking advantage of weak enrollment processes for obtaining those credentials. When should this user have access, right? This is the lifecycle portion of things. If somebody has access to something today because it's a job requirement, if they change jobs, if they leave the company, if those aren't cleaned up, these become orphaned accounts, they become excess entitlements, and those are exploited as attackers move laterally throughout the organization and as they take advantage of elevated privileges. And probably one of the most important here, why does this user have access in the first place? Is this access appropriate to their job? Is this a common level of access for the role that they have within the organization? Can we take a look at other peers within that organization and say, yeah, this makes sense for this user to have this access? So it creates a much bigger attack surface, a much bigger area of responsibilities that we need to take a look at to really fully understand these attacks against identity. So 2022, I call this the year of the MFA attack. We're going to talk about 3 specific attacks here today and break these down, but I mean, there was a number. I mean, there was many, many high-profile attacks that took place last year. We're going to look at 3 in particular. First, in March, FBI and CISA announced that there was a Russian state-sponsored attack on a non-governmental organization that took advantage of some misconfigurations in the organization's multi-factor authentication system and used that to elevate privileges and take advantage of things. So we'll take a look at that one. The second one, Lapsus. So I think many of you are probably familiar with Lapsus. They were involved in a number of high-profile attacks last year against Microsoft, against NVIDIA, Uber, others, right? So we'll take a look at one in particular that involved a service provider, Okta, and more specifically, a subcontractor to a service provider and how that led to a chain of events to future compromise. And the final, if there was one new word that I think would make its way into the Oxford English Dictionary as of last year, from our industry, it's prompt bombing, also known as MFA fatigue. So this is a relatively new type of attack, but uses very, very old school methods of social engineering, trying to trick users into doing things that they shouldn't and authorizing a transaction that they had no business authorizing. So in this particular case, Lapsus was involved yet again. There was a very high profile attack on Uber, where an employee was tricked into believing that they were talking to an IT help desk person. They approved an authentication on their mobile phone. This gave the attacker access to assets within Uber and their AWS instance. More specifically, it looks like the attacker went after the Uber bug bounty system, right? So this is a particularly interesting move on the attacker's part because they were going after the database that stored previously undisclosed vulnerability, right? I mean, this gave the attacker information that could become a valuable asset in launching additional attacks on the company, right? So I mean, these guys are obviously very smart in terms of the assets that they're going after. Now, one thing I'll point out here is that these 3 attacks involve very different vectors. So the first one really looked at the configuration of the authentication system. The second took advantage of some subcontractors within the authentication provider, SaaS provider in this case. And the third went directly after the user. What I find interesting here is that, as technologists, we often debate the relative merits of various different technologies. Is biometric secure? What about OTP? Is FIDO really phishing resistant, right? And these are things that are important for us to understand, but the reality is that none of these attacks took advantage of the authentication technology. They circumvented the authentication technology by using a lot of, very traditional and old school means. So before we go into that, the public service announcement here, right? We're going to talk about ways that MFA could be and has been exploited, but let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? MFA is still very, very important because you'll see that a lot of these attacks begin with the password, right? I mean, passwords still continue to be the weakest link from social engineering attacks, man-in-the-middle and eavesdropping type attacks, or just taking advantage of human nature, brute force attacks, things like rainbow tables, which are just looking at the most commonly used passwords and trying to apply them all over the place, right? So I mean, these are still very, very effective attacks. So MFA is a critical linchpin that we have in order to secure our identities. Now, the key here is that 82% of attacks, according to the latest Verizon data breach survey, involve the human element, right? So as practitioners, we got to concern ourselves not just with the technology. How do we make technology consumable by our end users? How do we make it easy? How do we make it intuitive? How do we make it invisible, right? These things you'll see will become very, very important. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll take a look at these 3 attacks. We'll break each of them down, take a look at what happened, and then we'll begin to take a little look at some of the flaws or failings in those systems. And then at the end, we'll take some takeaways, and hopefully you guys can go back and apply some of these things in your own environment. So we'll start with this non-governmental organization. Again, this was reported as being a state-sponsored attack by CISA and the FBI as sort of a warning to the rest of the world. And so let's take a look at this attack. As many of these do, the attack actually began with a compromise of a password. So in this particular case, it was a brute force attack. The attacker targeted a particular individual within the organization, just tried a bunch of random passwords until eventually they hit the right one, and were able to take advantage of that to get into the user's account using a username and password. From there, what was interesting is that they targeted this specific account because this was an account that we call an orphaned account. It didn't belong to anybody. This was a user who had left the organization, but their AD credentials remained. So you had a username, a password, not used by anybody, not monitored by anybody, right? So I mean, it's no surprise that this account was targeted. Once the attacker was in place, they were actually able to move throughout the organization for a period of about 10 months because nobody had any idea that that account existed, right? So from there, here's where things start to get interesting. The attacker then used this account and attempted to enroll into the multi-factor authentication system. It was Duo in this particular case. And the enrollment process by default was set up to allow any account to enroll, including orphaned accounts, and to enroll using only a username and password, right? So here we got a fundamental problem where you have a strong credential, but you don't have a strong process for issuing that credential, right? The compromised password was the only thing required to be able to enroll for MFA. From there, MFA was used to log into the VPN. That VPN was sort of the front door into everything. They had full network access from that point in time. Again, the attacker was able to move through that network laterally, poke, explore for about a period of 10 months because they had this orphaned account. They used a particular vulnerability called the print nightmare vulnerability, and they used this to gain elevated privileges on the domain controller for this particular user account, right? So they've got a land and expand strategy now. And from that point in time, this is, I think, one of the more interesting elements, right? So now they've got an account. That account has admin permissions on the domain controller, but they still don't have full multi-factor authentication for this domain controller account. So what they did is this domain controller was protected by Duo, the cloud-based MFA system, but they went in and manipulated the local host file on the domain controller so that rather than that machine using DNS to go find the Duo system, it was redirected to its own local IP address, right? So what happens in this particular case is, the domain controller tries to perform a multi-factor authentication, can't reach the Duo system, and by default, this was configured for a fail-open approach, meaning that if MFA is unavailable, you just skip that step, right? So at this point in time, the attacker, literally goes into a .host file. If you ever use this as a text file, you type in your local IP address, right, 127.0.1, boom, multi-factor authentication is off, right? Very, very unsophisticated type of an attack with major, major repercussions, right? Now that the user owns the domain controller, they're able to, wash, rinse, and repeat. They did the same thing now, compromising account after account after account until they got to the one that they want, and were able to move on from there, right? So, you see the series of steps are, pretty straightforward, and there was a lot of, opportunities for us to kind of dissect this particular one. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the lessons learned here, right? So, the first thing is, we wherever possible, we need to strengthen or eliminate our use of passwords, right? As you'll see in many of these, it began with a brute force attack on the password. One word of caution here, right? Usually people think strengthening passwords. All right, so let's make our passwords, 15 characters, complex characters, make them expire every 30 days, different passwords for everything, right? And while from a technology standpoint that seems great, as all of us has experienced, nobody can remember those passwords. You can't keep track of them, right? So I mean, who here, and I won't ask people to raise their hands, have an account that you use so infrequently that you never actually remember the password? Every time you log in, you do so by asking to reset your password. Okay, I see a lot of nodding heads. I do it too, right? Because the challenge is we can't remember. We write things down, we put them in password vaults, we do all these other crazy things. We use the same password everywhere, right? I mean, who's seen an attack where you compromise a Gmail account and you're like, let's try that same password on somebody's AD account, and it's the same password, right? So we got to strengthen passwords or eliminate passwords, but we got to be really careful in terms of how we do that. So what we want to do is look at MFA as not the traditional model of password plus a step up to MFA, but let's start taking a look at multi-factor authentication mechanisms we can use as the primary authentication method, right? So FIDO is a pretty common example of that, and we'll talk a little bit about FIDO here in a bit as well. Next thing, so default configurations. This is really, really important, right? So I mean, when you deploy a system, don't assume that the default configurations are the security best practices, right? I mean, you'll see, I think, a wide spectrum of approaches from different vendors. In this particular case, there were a couple things that were really bad in the default setup, right? Number one, there's no lockout policy, right? I mean, this was a brute force attack, so this attacker kept trying password after password after password until they got the right one. I mean, these accounts should lock out after 3 or 5, unsuccessful password attempts. MFA enrollment. Your MFA credential is only as strong as the enrollment process that gets you there, right? So if your enrollment requires only a password, that's going to be a relatively weak MFA credential, despite the technology involved in that, right? Identity governance, this is really important, kind of comes back to that first slide. It's not just about who is the user, why do they have that access in the first part? If you're not employing strong identity governance and administration processes in your organization today, I'd highly encourage you to begin to take a look at that. We need to understand who has access to what, whether or not these accounts are legitimate, do we have orphaned accounts within our organization, and finally, never fail open, right? There are too many alternatives out there today, right? So, I mean, look for MFA solutions that allow you to deal with the unexpected without failing open, right? There are solutions out there that have hybrid approaches where if the cloud's not available, you can still authenticate to an online, on-prem resources. There are solutions out there that offer offline authentication where even if the cloud service is unavailable, you can still perform a strong authentication using offline means, right? So explore these solutions as opposed to that fail open approach. So, in terms of securing the credential lifecycle, kind of highlighted this, but this is a really important point, right? So I'll ask a question here. Should everyone be eligible for MFA? Yes or no? Who thinks yes? Everyone should have MFA in the organization, okay? I see a lot of hands. All right, so this is a bit of a trick question, right? I think every individual should be protected by MFA. In this particular case, you have individuals or accounts in that organization that belong to nobody, right? So, I mean, if somebody left your organization, they shouldn't have an MFA credential anymore, right? So a little bit of a trick question, but want you to think about this a little bit, right? We need to understand who the legitimate users are and not just kind of blindly say, oh, let's give MFA to everybody. Secure credentials, only secure if you maintain that chain of custody. So NIST SB 863, I think hope everybody here is very familiar with those standards, right? There's standards for identity proofing, authentication, and federation. And these three link together because you need to make sure that you maintain that chain of custody. Strong enrollment, strong authentication, strong federation, right? So that's very, very important. Multi-factor authentication must be protected by multi-factor enrollment. So we talked a little bit about that, right? So there are a lot of different ways to do this, right? And organizations approach this different way. In sort of the more traditional secure organization, credentials are handed out in person, right? Now, a lot of us aren't able to do that in today's world, but I mean, we can use things like, a registered email account, a registered mobile number. We can augment those by third-party services that sort of work together with the cellular carriers to see whether or not a mobile phone number legitimately belongs to the right person. We can use identity proofing services. We can require users to be on network. So there's a lot of different techniques that we can use so that we're not relying on that single failure point, the password, in our enrollment process. All right, so let's take a look at the second one. So lapsus, again, involved in a number of different attacks. This particular one, we're going to take a look at an attack on Okta via a third-party contractor, Cytel. So in this particular case, the attacker gains access to the subcontractor Cytel's network through a VPN compromise, and this is kind of a little bit vague in terms of how they actually, got onto this. So Cytel was contracted by Okta to provide third-party customer support services for Okta customers. So in this particular case, the Cytel employees could do things like reset an admin password for an Okta customer's tenant, right? So that was one of their primary functions. So this attacker, rather than trying to go after Okta, they went after Cytel, they got into their network. From there, they kind of had full network access. So same type of story you saw before, right? They start snooping around. What can I find? What can I do? At some point, this attacker was able to add themselves to the group tenant administrators within the Cytel network, right? And so, one of the possible attack vectors here is, there was a file discovered called domain admin's LastPass. Like, you can draw your own conclusions in terms of what that file might have been, right? But so, suddenly after finding this file, they have, a tenant administrator access. So this gives them now access to the Cytel support system, the Okta support tools that Cytel is using. Now the attacker says that they had discovered AWS super user keys in a Slack channel. I don't buy that. Okta's refuted that, right? I think what happened here is that they got access to the specific program used by Cytel to do password resets, right? So, the question is, in this case, could they actually take over an account using this tool? It seems like the answer is probably no. Like, they could reset a password, but they couldn't view those passwords. But, this is still a problem, right? They have access to customer tenants, customer data. There's a lot of things they could do impersonating a Cytel employee, speaking to Okta customers on behalf of Okta. So if we break this down, then, one of the things that, just the full disclosure, right? So, I work for RSA. I work for a competitor of Okta. I'm not here to bash Okta. In fact, the more I dug into this, I looked at Cytel's reports, Mandiant's reports, Okta's report. I think Okta actually did a pretty good job on their side in terms of trying to contain the attack once it was in progress, right? But, for those of you who've kind of monitored the news, Okta really got a black eye on this particular incident, right? And a lot of it came down to, transparency, right? So this is something that I would encourage everybody here. In times of crisis, transparency is more critical than ever. Initially, Okta downplayed it, then they kind of blamed Cytel, and they went through a bunch of motions. I don't think they needed to do that. I think they just kind of came clean with it from the very beginning. The narrative in the press would have been very, very different, right? The next thing I would say is that, for those of you who are practitioners, right, and you're looking at, should I deploy something on-prem? Should I go with a hosted service provider? If you go with a SaaS solution, right, and many of you are today, I think it's really important to, ask the right questions of your service providers. One of the questions that, some of our customers ask, many don't, is who do you use for third-party contractors, right? I think that's an important question to ask. You want to know who has access to your data, who is operating on behalf of that service provider that you choose. Since attackers can move laterally, MFA should be used with all applications. Now, I'll admit, this is a little bit of speculation on my part, right? But this attacker, nowhere in this attack does it sound like they got access to an MFA credential, right? They got onto the network, they created an account, they had access to Slack channels, they had access to other things, right? So I have to question, was Okta using multi-factor authentication on all these internal resources? I don't know, right? But so again, that's a question that we should ask. I would say that we should be using MFA for everything, right? And the last thing is that Rohit talked about this yesterday in his keynote as well. Security, convenience, compliance. We're all tasked with juggling all three of those. And often I get asked, like, well, security versus convenience. What do we do? Do we make these trade-offs and everything else, right? It's a very difficult question for us to wrestle with. I would argue that we're looking for the and. How do we achieve security and convenience simultaneously? This is where risk AI and machine learning and our ability to use context and data are really going to be able to help us here as we go forward in the future. So we think about taking an intelligent approach to identity, how we achieve security and convenience simultaneously, right? These are all techniques that are available today. They're available from many vendors, not just from RSA. But the first thing that we want to take a look at is that when a user authenticates, it's more than just presenting a credential. Here's my MFA, therefore I am Dave Taku. We want to inspect everything going on with that transaction. Where's the user located? Are they coming from a known machine? Is this an account that they should have access to? What else is going on with it in this system, right? So there's a lot of context that we can begin to build to sort of further bolster our understanding beyond just the credential to say, do we really have high confidence that this user is who they claim to be, right? We want to understand that with every single authentication request, and we want to challenge that every single time a user makes a request to a particular application, right? So single sign-on, you think about how these things are configured, session cookies, long session cookies, right? We want to make sure that as users move from application to application, that we are assessing risk again and again, because this lateral movement is very, very common in these types of attacks. Second thing is we want to understand not only what's going on with the user, we want to understand what's going on with the applications. Is this a sensitive application? Is it a less sensitive application? Here's another example where I think NIST does a great job in terms of providing some great best practices here in SB 863, the establishment of trust zones. I've talked to people where they say, well, we got 10 different categorizations of risk. And that becomes very difficult, very subjective, like what's a 6 versus what's a 7, right? I found that in a lot of these exercises, a lot of these conversations, three remains the magic number, right? I mean, people can understand high, medium, and low, and that's a lot more easy for us to deal with. And when you get to 6 versus 7, I mean, those distinctions really make very little difference, right? But understanding what's risky, what's not, what has sensitive data, what has PII, this will help you, understand, what the application side of things is. And then we want to make sure these match, right? So if we've got a highly sensitive application, our bar should be higher. If we got a less sensitive application, our bar can be lower, so long as we are continuously evaluating, and when that user moves from low to high, we reassess to the new standard, right? So this is important, and these are some of the techniques that allow us to use multiple factors of invisible authentication on top of the credential so that we can get a stronger assurance of who the user claims to be without putting that burden entirely on the end user, and making sure that our evaluation of risk is commensurate with what the user is trying to access. Okay, so third one, prompt bombing here. So this was the attack on Uber that took place in September. I love this term, prompt bombing. I don't know who came up with it. But let's take a look at this attack, right? So the hacker obtains access to the employee's AD password. Again, was this a brute force attack? Was it social engineering? We don't know, but they've got the first factor of authentication already. And now in this particular case, access was protected by two-factor authentication using mobile push, right? So you have a mobile app, push notification comes to your phone, it says, is this you? Approve or deny, right? So in this particular case, the attacker kept doing username, password, the employee kept getting these things, deny, right? Finally, the attacker's like, well, I can't get this guy to press accept, so he calls him up and says, hey, I'm with the Uber help desk, we're running a test, can you please press approve this time? The guy's like, okay, here you go, approve, right? So, there's a fatigue aspect, wore the guy down, and eventually it's like, all right, let's just get that off my plate, right? So old school social engineering attacks. Once they had the MFA, they got VPN access. Third example we've seen of this, right? VPN access. The credential gets them in the VPN. Now they get access to everything, right? So they're snooping around the network. In this case, they find a Microsoft PowerShell script used for automating tasks within their PAM system. Privileged access management had the PAM credentials right there. Now they're able to log into the PAM system. They're able to add themselves an account. Now they're administrators. They can check out the admin keys, and they get access to the bug bounty system, right? So, lessons learned here, humans are the weakest link, right? This should actually be number one of all these things. Humans are the weakest link. Zero trust, right? So there's two things I want to point out here, right? Zero trust is really about, limiting that attack surface in multiple different ways. If you look at the 7 tenets of zero trust, they're all about how do we reduce the attack surface. There's two things that went wrong here, right? Who has access to what? Why did this particular employee have access to the full network into this PowerShell script? I mean, there's no reason why this employee should have access to that, right? So we got to get away from this model of we got a trusted zone, VPN gets you in the front door. Once you're in the front door, you can do whatever you want. That's a fundamental principle of zero trust, contained to the fine-grained set of entitlements that user needs. Make this a risk-based approach and not a network-based approach. push to approve, right? So I think a lot of people have come down on this method of authentication and said, oh, push to approve, we got to get rid of this. This is no good. The fact of the matter is that users, when you go through repeat motions, we've all seen this, right? You just start ticking the box. You're not paying attention to what's going on. So a lot of these apps say, is this really you? This authentication came from this location. Here's a map. It's this application. People are like, yeah, whatever. Yes, rest. So, we need to do have something to interrupt the user and force them to actually pay attention. So this idea of code match is becoming more common, where the website displays a number, the app displays a choice of different numbers. Rather than just approving, you have to actually select the right number. So either, the user just 1 out of 4 guessed it, or they're like, okay, well, let me look at the website. Wait, what website? This isn't me. I didn't ask for this, right? So it's just kind of a way of getting the user to wake up and pay attention to what's going on. And the last thing here, FIDO, right? So FIDO is becoming very, very popular. As RSA, we're a big proponent of FIDO. We're a part of the FIDO board and an active member of the FIDO Alliance. I will say that, we often get asked, is this the future password list? Should we all go? And I think it's heading that direction, right? I think FIDO is a tremendous technology. The FIDO Alliance today is wrestling with a lot of the same sort of ecosystem issues around FIDO, right? So some of the things are current challenges with FIDO, right? So FIDO is great for web-based technology. It doesn't really work with a lot of the legacy technologies that you might have on-prem. As an end user, it can be very burdensome because the whole idea is that I create a single pairwise key relationship with every application. So are you gonna have a user create 200 registration events with 200 different applications? It's still susceptible to weak enrollment. If I use a username and password to enroll for a FIDO key, then how strong is my FIDO key? And there aren't a lot of really good recovery options. I remember the FAQ in the FIDO Alliance. The very first question is, what do I do if I lose my FIDO key? And the answer was, you're hosed. So get 2 FIDO keys and put 1 in a safe. So these are things that fortunately the FIDO Alliance is dealing with, right? So recent FIDO developments, number one, improved platform support, right? So every major browser, every OS now has native support for FIDO. This is really, really important. There are expanded options for software and contactless. Like I can take my iPhone and I can create a FIDO credential right there on my iPhone. NFC now makes it possible for me to tap and go, so I don't need that USB port. I don't need the specialized client software. A big question we get asked is it a consumer technology? Is it an enterprise technology? The answer is somewhere in the middle, right? So this FIDO began life as a number of consumer organizations getting together and say, hey, listen, we don't want to be the next company that has our smash and grab attack and we lose a whole database of passwords. Let's make this the end user's problem. Right, so that's where FIDO started, not really an enterprise-grade technology. RSA, Yubico, a number of companies have gotten involved in the FIDO Alliance and are driving a lot of the best practices to make this enterprise-grade. So one of the most significant advancements just took place about 2 weeks ago. Who's familiar with sort of the passkey developments within FIDO? Right, so Microsoft, Google, Apple, they said, big problem with FIDO is that people change their phones every year. They got to re-enroll for a FIDO credential. I know what we'll do. We'll make it so that a user can actually store a copy of their FIDO key in their iCloud account or their Gmail account. They get a new phone, they can download it again, right? Great from a convenience perspective, terrible from a security perspective, right? Because now all I need is your iCloud password and I can download your FIDO keys, right? So, RSA and a number of like-minded companies have really fought within the FIDO Alliance to drive more of a security mindset. And the Alliance has just ratified new standards that are going to allow enterprises to have the control as to whether or not they allow these portable pass keys or if you require device resident keys, right? So these are some of the things that I think are going to really make FIDO better in the long run. So I think we're running up against clock. Let's talk about takeaways then, and I'll give you 3 takeaways. But first of all, I'll leave you with another quote. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I don't know why people attribute this to Einstein, but I don't know. Anyhow, so we need to take a different approach. We need to look at things a little bit differently. So 3 things. Again, 82% of attacks involve the human element. We've got to solve fundamentally the human problem, right? We got to understand how people think. It's like, listen, I'm just doing my job. I get things done. Like, we can't be the impediments to productivity. So whenever we can use these invisible risk-based techniques to augment authentication so that we don't have to impede user progress in what they're trying to do. Things like the code matching within prompt bombing. Like, let's understand that people just kind of are creatures of habit. So if something changes, we got to be like bold up in people's faces. Like, stop, take a look at this. You need to pay attention, right? So these are some of the things we need to do. Second thing, MFA, still your best first line of defense, right? So I'll go back to that first slide again, right? 3 high-profile attacks on MFA. None of them was a fundamental breach of the underlying MFA technology, right? Still very, very sound, whether you're using FIDO, OTP, push notifications, right? The technology is very solid, very trusted, and far better than passwords, right? So use MFA, use it everywhere. Make sure you're using it correctly. Beware of default configurations. Look for vendors who really prioritize security over convenience, and they're going to have default configurations that aren't fail open, for example. Third takeaway, security involves more than just MFA, right? So this obviously this session was titled MFA, and I guess it worked because we got a sold out crowd here, right? But I am encouraging you all, I'm challenging you to think about this as more than just an MFA problem. It is an identity problem, right? So first and foremost, take a security first mindset. Beware of those insecure defaults. Make sure that we're looking at not just how people use MFA to authenticate, but how are they enrolling for those MFA credentials? What are you doing in a scenario where somebody has lost a credential or a credential stolen? How do we recover those, secure that entire lifecycle process of the credential and of the overall identity account? And so for us to be able to employ zero trust principles, we need to limit access. We need to reduce that attack surface and the opportunity for these attackers to move laterally. It's not just about where they got in, and you see in each of these attacks, the initial compromise was pretty benign, right? But the ability for them to snoop throughout the network, find things that they should never have had access to in the first place, and exploit those to move laterally, that was the real challenge in a lot of these attacks, right? And so finally, think about those 5 W's again: who, what, where, when, and why. Why do users have access to things? I think this is the most overlooked thing out of everything, right? I mean, we put the provisioning in place so that we can add an account and hopefully remove an account when that user leaves, but do we ever question why that user has access to this? Is that access appropriate, right? So there's some great tools, and this is an area where risk intelligence and machine learning is really advancing in the area of governance. Being able to do things like peer analysis. It's like, well, this individual has access to this particular application. Nobody else in the department has access to that application. Why? Like, let's just ask the question, why, right? And then, explore that. So we need tools that are going to use risk intelligence because we can't dig through all of those different entitlements. Rohit, again, in his keynote, talked about this move from coarse grain to fine grain entitlements. This means that the number of entitlements in an organization is going to grow exponentially and become much more dynamic in terms of how those change. We cannot do that alone. We need, strong tools and intelligent tools to help us in that endeavor. And so with that, I want to thank you everyone for joining today. I hope you got something out of this that you can take home with you. Look forward to seeing many of you throughout the course of the conference this week. Thank you.